World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Thank you for joining once again to our members on Zoom, to the live audience with our presenter here today. Looking forward to a great show. It's going to be a little bit of a hybrid kind of presentation that we haven't seen before. But without further ado, I will turn the meeting over to our Vice President of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading to introduce our speaker, Mr. David Bean.
Thank you, Mike. And I'd like to begin by thanking the team over at Park Road Presbyterian Church. That's where our presenter is live today. And he's coming to us through their good offices. So certainly thank you to Senior Pastor Chris DeVitro and his entire team for working with us to facilitate this presentation today. Our presenter today is Jayson Casper, who is the Middle East correspondent for Christianity Today. Since 2019, he and his family have lived in Beirut, Lebanon. Prior to that, he reported since 2011 from Cairo in Egypt. Additionally, he has lived in Jordan, Tunisia, and Mauritania. He is seconded through Ideas, an organization connecting skilled Christian professionals with educational and development opportunities throughout the world. He is competent in Arabic with a degree in Islamic Studies. Jayson reports at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. This presentation, it's actually had a number of different titles. But when I talked to Jayson several days ago to finalize the presentation for today, we thought it would be good for him to present on his experiences as a correspondent in the Middle East for the last 10 years. And he brings a very unique perspective to that presentation because of his ability to talk about the social impacts of political decisions on the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim community in that very explosive region of the world. And obviously there has been a lot of turmoil there recently that he's able to talk to us about directly. So without further ado, I welcome Jayson to present to us today. Jayson, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Jayson Casper. I am the Middle East correspondent for Christianity Today, where on a freelance basis, beginning in 2009, I was reporting from Egypt about all through the events of the Arab Spring, and in the last 2 years have reported from Beirut, Lebanon. All of you, of course, remember last August, the terrible explosion that hit Beirut and its port and leveled half the city. And I look forward, when we're done speaking today, to be able to describe and just answer your questions about really anything in the region. I cover Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, but today's talk is going to focus on the country of Lebanon. It's too much, of course, just to cover all in one session. The title is going to be The Crisis in Lebanon and the Family that Lives Through It. Now, I speak of family for a couple reasons. One, I love my kids. They're not going to be here or bother you with any of their shenanigans, but being there as a family kind of reflects two things. One, it's a bit of a throwback to the old idea of the foreign correspondent. There's a crisis in journalism these days. Not many publications are able to afford having someone live full-time in the region or the nation they report from. And through a cooperation agreement that we have at Christianity Today with an organization called Ideas, we are able to earn enough money to support our family of 6 in that region of the world to develop over time, not just a familiarity with the events, but a love and a care for the people who live there. Now, today, of course, I want to express my thanks to the World Affairs Council of Reading to facilitate my being able to present today from Park Road Presbyterian Church here in Reading. And if you've noticed, this is a rather unusual setup for a church building. There is here going on a vacation Bible school for the local children here, and they have adopted a bit of a train theme. Now, that also is very appropriate for the family setting because over in Lebanon, one of our favorite spots to go and picnic is an abandoned train station. Abandoned there is the key word. Nobody really wants to have their little children traipsing around on the tracks with the trains going back and forth. Lebanon used to have one of the most advanced and up-to-date train systems in the entire Middle East back in the Ottoman Empire. Ever since then, with the onset of the Civil War in 1975, the whole industry collapsed. And so now left all throughout stations in the country are locomotives, train tracks, left where trees are growing through them, the grass is everywhere, you can pick out the old artifacts even and wonder, this is what life used to be like there. Now, that's not just fun for picnicking, it's also a decent illustration of some of the problems of the country. Because that train station is actually funded to the tune of $8 million per year. That is the budget that Lebanon still allocates to the Department of Government responsible for public transportation and railways. Now, what do they get for that? There's about 40 public buses that mostly don't run, and there are 0 trains. Why does the department still exist? Where does this $8 million go? Well, of course, there's corruption in every country, and everyone knows that there is largesse and contracts that are handed out here and there. But in Lebanon, the story goes a little bit deeper than that. And to illustrate, I will have to tell you a story of my daughter. This is from Egypt. She was about 5 or 6 years old at the time, but the anecdote applies to Lebanon as well. We had invited an American friend over to dinner one night. She didn't know this family, and she was just asking who was coming to supper. And she then gave us the question, Daddy, is he a Muslim or a Christian? And I kind of was aghast a little bit, like, what are you even asking for? Who cares? He's just an American, right? He's a friend of ours. But she, who had been making friends in the Egyptian setting without any impact from us, naturally thought to wonder, what is the religion of this individual? Now, what was going on in her mind? What goes on in the mind of so many Middle Easterners? In Lebanon, for example, if you simply tell your name to someone you're meeting for the first time, there's a good chance that they can identify not only your religious sect, but also the village that you originally come from. We've had fun in Hamlaya, for example. And in Hamlaya, you are either a Sfair or a Reyes. Hatfield McCoy to some degree. They know. We, as Americans, have given up that idea. We shouldn't know. At least we shouldn't care about how it interacts with you as a person. My daughter, of course, probably didn't care either if it was a Muslim or Christian. You just need to know. It doesn't matter in terms of faith, what you believe. It matters your identity, who you belong to, and who will back you. Now, this is inevitable in Lebanon among all the different countries of the Middle East. There are 18 recognized religious sects in the country, and all of them have their place in society where they cooperate, but also jockey for position. And to illustrate this, of course, many of you in the World Affairs Council may be familiar with this already, but for others who are listening in, there is a necessity for a crash course in Lebanese sectarianism. The president, for example, is a Maronite Catholic Christian. Of all the Lebanese that exist, only people from that sect can be elected president. Well, the Christians have this political privilege. Sunni Muslims have the position of prime minister. And in the overall workings of government, this is really the head of state and the one who controls most of the government operations. There is the third major sect in Lebanon, and that is the Shiite Muslims, and they have the position of the Speaker of Parliament. Parliament, of course, is 128 seats divided evenly between Muslims and Christians. They have the idea that we as Muslims and Christians are partners in this country, and therefore a 50-50 division seems fair. Now, it was fair back in the 1932 census, which is the last one that the country actually conducted. It's too politically sensitive to have any more now. But back then, Christians were a small majority, or at least a 50-50 percentage. Nowadays, no one really knows. But the rule of thumb is to understand that each of these three major sects has 1/3 of the population. And so with this, Sunnis, Shiites, and Christians they interact to various degrees of cooperation and coexistence. It's often quite good and inspiring. If they were to keep to the tenets of their faith, the country might do quite well. There is a verse in Psalms, for example, that illustrates this. It says, "The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar in Lebanon." So that idea of righteousness is connected to the very country. That's an example of the steadfast straightness that can exist if one does what is good. However, what we know from Lebanon is that the corruption indexes in the world put Lebanon number 149 out of 180 in the entire world. So a better verse from Psalms comes to mind, and that is, "There is no one righteous, no, not one." Now, there's stories, of course, of good people, and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. But for now, that idea of corruption goes throughout the entire country. We moved there and we got our apartment in our neighborhood, and I started seeing signs for a ping pong club. So I investigated, I went there. The guy at the desk is actually somebody who goes to one of the churches that we know. And so I was sitting with him trying to learn more. He said, "Yeah, we operate. In fact, we applied for a government grant of $5,000 to stimulate local enterprise, local sports participation." But while we were going through the process, the man at the very low level of administration told me I have to sign over $1,000 to him in order to receive the $4,000 myself. Over the years, of course, the government share kept getting lower and lower. That bureaucrat kept demanding the same $1,000 for himself. Now, what about my friend who paid that? Is he sharing himself in the corruption? Does he become corrupted? Or should he just walk away and not do the good that he wanted to do for the community in playing ping pong? Well, we know another individual who walked away. A friend of ours in a different church spoke of his relative who lives in Australia. He came back to Lebanon with a great plan to stimulate wind turbines. Lebanon lacks 24-hour electricity. It's worse now. They can almost fund only a few hours every day, but even in the good days, they were not able to extend electricity provision to every home. So why not use natural energy? It's a great project. The politician responsible for that area told him, "Please come, set it up, invest your money, and just sign over a mere 50% of your revenue profits to me." So that Australian went back to his country where it is possible for him to be righteous. What do you do in a place like this? Of course, all of these $8 million here, wasted projects here, it just spills over and it contributes slowly but surely to the overall debt of the nation. One other example to give you, just going back to the railroads, for example. Why don't they shut this down? Well, there is an example of Lebanon shutting down an industry that was no longer valid. Back in 1910, the silk industry was on its last legs. Up until then, it had really funded much of the country. But in 1910, the industry collapsed. It was not until the year 2000 that Lebanon canceled the government department to promote silk production worldwide. Why? Because the employees there were there as the recipients of political patronage. And that explains the basis of sectarianism in Lebanon. The state exists to dole out jobs and contracts to the political partisans connected to every sect. And if you're going to get rid of that department, how many people are going to lose their jobs? If you're going to try to scale down that department over time, people are going to be forced to leave, and there'll be a problem created in some other random department. Just so you fire this Sunni, we're going to make trouble for that Shiite. And then the Christian, of course, has to wait for his turn to get fired too. No one will ever do this. It'll make too many problems. So they wait until everyone retires and they live off that extra $8 million every year, as before the crisis started, the debt ballooned to 150% of the gross domestic product. the third highest total in the world. Lebanon lived that way for a long time, of course, but it was not until they canceled their debt. The whole international community said, we're not funding you anymore until you make reforms for this corruption. And Gulf states decided, we're not going to bail you out with $1 million gifts any longer because you have this problem called Hezbollah, and we don't like that they're participating in your government. So with this, everything collapsed. During COVID, of course, every nation in the world suffered some degree of economic contraction. In Lebanon, it was 20%. That's how much of the economy was lost because of the problems going on there. What happened? Inflation, at the same time everyone is losing their jobs, went up 84%. And on top of that, 50% of the population of what was once a flourishing middle-class society, 50% now live below the poverty line. To put this in terms that are a little bit more understandable, a teacher's salary, just to take them as an indication, roughly about $3,000 a month, the equivalent of the local currency. With the devaluation of the lira, that individual now makes less than $300 a month. They had been in the habit of taking European vacations, getting plastic surgery, sending their kids off to college somewhere in North America. Now, the government has clamped down and frozen every bank account so that even the savings that they had cannot be accessed. It's a terrible country and they're going through a terrible time. The peg, the lira, was set to the US dollar at a rate of $1 to 1,500 lira. Now, $1 will get you 15,000 lira. Excuse me. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, it's up to 22,000. We were having this conversation at dinner the other day, and one of my children, I won't say which one, said, "Oh, that's great, Daddy. It means we can buy more stuff now, right?" It is true. He's quite good at math. One of the other children, of course, looked across him at the table and scoured at how can you think that in terms of our benefit when the people around us are suffering? What does it mean practically? Oh, we have good relations with our neighbors. If we try to visit them now, even for tea, or invite them to our homes, the system of reciprocity and hospitality will demand of them an expenditure that they can no longer afford. So does it mean we just sit back and ignore them? I don't know what we do. This is the problem that they're going through now. So March 2020, they defaulted on their debt. Only a few months later, in August, of course, the explosion happened. We were sitting at home. Our neighborhood is about 15 miles from the epicenter, and we sit about 1,000 feet above sea level in one of the Lebanese mountains. Still, that blast shook the windows on our home. We thought it was an earthquake. We went outside and we noticed the orange plume going up into the sky. We met our neighbors as they also were confused, wondering what's going on, frantically searching on Twitter to try to find out what had happened. We actually made a good friend that day among neighbors that we didn't know. After the blast, the government resigned. They put in one government for a little while before that, of course, and then after this resignation, they continued serving in a caretaker capacity, unable to make any crucial government decisions that could save the economy. During this time, they have to negotiate new leadership. So they picked a Sunni, for example, in order to help them run the show. And that man has now taken 11 months, and as of last week just resigned, saying, "I am unable to come to terms with all the politics of our country to form a government that we can agree upon." Nearly a whole year since that blast has been wasted, and the government has done next to nothing in order to fix things. There has been no government that could fix things. In the midst of a national crisis, they can't agree. Now, to understand why this is the fact, we have to look a little bit at the political sectarianism that goes on in the country. There is one explanation that they couldn't form a government because they're really just waiting to figure out which way the world is going to go. President Trump canceled the nuclear deal with Iran. Now we have President Biden, who's looking like he's going to try to revive it. Is it going to be successful or not? We don't know. Neither does Lebanon, but it might make a difference onto who the government in Lebanon should be. Are we going to have an Iran-friendly government or a Western-friendly government? Why should they make a decision until they know what way America is going to go? So one theory says they're actually purposefully not taking a decision to form a government until they know where they're going to fit into the regional order. Another theory for why they have no government at this moment says they simply can't make all the pieces fit in the internal politics. They keep squabbling over positions. So within the Lebanese systems, the Christians have basically two main political parties. There are others, but the president currently belongs to the dominant one. The Shiites also have two main political parties. One of them is Hezbollah. One is another entity that formed out of the civil war that tends to be more Western in its orientation. But as Shiites, these two parties have agreed mostly to cooperate with one another. Then you have the Sunnis. They have one main political party and several others, but they're not unified at all. Basically, the political party of the Sunnis is simply a matter of patronage. And in an economic crisis, there's no patronage, so why should anybody get excited about joining them? The current dominant system in government is for the main Christian party and Hezbollah to make an alliance, and that elected the president, who is now pro-Hezbollah in his orientation as a Christian, and at the same time, trying to keep open relations with the West. The Sunni, who should be prime minister based on his leadership of that community, is outside of that alliance. But everyone knows that he's the Sunni that should be in charge, but he doesn't have the power to force himself in. And this is how they have been jockeying back and forth. Now, after that blast, France came in. They said, we will help with billions of dollars to reconstruct everything, bail out your economy. All you need to do are make the reforms necessary to end corruption. And we want you to form a government that's not connected to the political parties so that it can't be controlled by all these forces. Really, it sounds like a great idea. It's a technocrat's dream. But the Christians and Hezbollah are looking at this saying, we're going to cede all of our authority to you, Mr. Sunni Prime Minister, to put in people that you want to run the government? No, not unless you give us enough ministers so that we can block your decisions if we don't like it. Now, who's right and who's wrong on this would really have to take a lot more time to discuss. But these are the factors that show how sectarianism prevents Lebanon from working well, especially in moments of crisis. Now, there is another factor in all of this, of course, and that is civil society, the young people, the revolutionaries. We arrived in Lebanon, August, I believe, in 2019, and it wasn't 4 months later that I had to start living through another uprising and revolution. The one in Egypt didn't work out too well. I wasn't very optimistic about what's going to happen in Lebanon, but it was inspiring to watch Lebanese for the first time go down into their popular squares without the flags of their political parties. I was told that they had never done this before. Lebanon is a free country. You have the right to demonstrate, but every time they would do so, they were backing up their sect or their party. This time, they're saying, we don't want any of them. And so many Lebanese were galvanized by this hope that says, if we can just get rid of sectarianism, we'll be fine. Let's get rid of all of our leaders. Well, it didn't work so well. It wasn't even crushed. It just kind of petered out. In an economy that's tanked, in COVID where you have to stay in your homes, all the momentum has been lost for the most part. There is residue from this in the university elections, where candidates reflecting this non-sectarian trend are starting to win. They're also starting to win in the syndicates, the unions, the engineers, the lawyers, where the party figures are being pushed aside for something that's different. And so now we start to have to ask ourselves, of all these forces, is there a solution? Is there a way that we can understand there is a way to help this country find itself to an ability to run itself? Now, that question itself, I think, is going to have to ask the question even of our audience here. In the church, I presume that you are Christians, and there might be a sense, a part of you that says, okay, among these different Muslims groups and Christians, we should have at least a sympathy for the Christians, right? Maybe we should even back the Christians. Don't they need to be protected? We know what's going on in the rest of the Middle East. But then, of course, part of our audience here today is the World Affairs Council. And forgive my assumptions, but if I'm not right, you guys are multi-faith, but whatever your religion is, you would look at the world objectively to say, how can we have a system that works, that comes together probably on a secular basis so that everyone can make their decisions for the good of all? If we're all here in the same room and we started talking about this, however, we'd probably find that there is more consensus between these two groups than competition. And let me explain why. In Lebanon, to find a solution means to back somebody. But we step back, we say, no, we can't do that, right? Let's back nobody. We want to back the country. In fact, that's really the United States' position, right? We see Hezbollah as a problem. And of course, you can ask me what you like about that in the Q&A sessions. But if they are a problem, we as a country are going to back the Lebanese Army. That is the entity that brings all sects together. They unite the country. It's the only institution actually that's functioning and the only institution that does integrate all Lebanese components of society fairly well. However, by Lebanese tradition, the head of the army is a Christian. There's no way around it. The Christians run the army. Now, I'm probably not representing the institution fairly when I put it that bluntly, but that is how many Lebanese Muslims view the institution. It's just the way things work. The Sunnis run the police force and the Shiites run the intelligence services. But the army that the United States is investing in is to some degree the Christian security institution. Now, if we step back and we say, we're not going to support anybody as the United States, as the Western community, well, Sunnis are jockeying with Saudi Arabia and Turkey to support them. Shiites have the option of Iran and Syria to get support into their communities. If we step back and support nobody, what's happening to the Christians? They're getting left aside. This is not an argument on their behalf, of course. Maybe we could find a way to do it differently. Let's say we will support no one. What Lebanon needs is to get rid of all the sectarianism altogether. There's plenty of Lebanese who believe that, after all. And so what we need is one man, one vote, one district. You elect whoever you want to. Sounds like a good idea. Would it work in a country full of corruption and patronage? Wouldn't everyone just vote for the sect that they belong to anyway? And in fact, while I said the population is roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, people tend to think that it's actually the Shiites who have a bit of dominance in society. So if you give a free vote, maybe you end up with Hezbollah controlling everything. Is that the solution that we would like to look for? No. But maybe backing no one is actually the best thing, and over time it would work out well. There's plenty of Lebanese who think so. There's another solution that can be backing no one. And some Lebanese, particularly Christians, they like the idea of a federal state. What it does is it gets rid of sectarianism at the upper levels of government. No president, no prime minister, no army general, just let the best people filter into those positions. However, at the local level, we can be as sectarianism as we want to. So everyone knows, for example, that the Shiites live mostly in South Lebanon and in the valley that borders Syria. The Muslims live largely in the main cities. The Christians live largely in the mountains. And so an idea of federalism says each sect will govern itself. Elect whoever you want to within your sect. Rule yourself by whatever rules you want to. If Hezbollah wants to take over everything in the south, go ahead and let them. But we're going to put up people at the national level who will care only for the country. Might work, except that it's not really true that each sect sticks to himself. Everyone is everywhere. So what happens if you're living in a largely Christian mountain area when the village right across the valley from you is Shiite? Are they going to have a fair share of the monies that come to the local administration? Are they going to even feel like they're going to have to leave the area and you're actually going to balkanize this tiny country the size of Connecticut? It might not work. It might work. Who knows? There's Lebanese who like that idea too. Now, one idea, Christians love this one, of course, and so really, as we said, the United States kind of likes it too. You back no one by backing the Christians. That may be paradoxical to some degree, but like I said, we're already doing it in the Army. We're also already doing it in the educational sector. The United States gives millions of dollars every year to the American University of Beirut and the Lebanese American University. These are among the two best universities in the country. The Catholics also have a very strong institution as well, several of them throughout the country. But these two American universities were founded 150 years ago by missionaries, came preaching the gospel to these all sectors of Lebanese society. Now, these two universities have since become secular, but they receive American support. And though they are not preaching a gospel, they are, so to speak, preaching the gospel of Western civilization. Now, the university professors themselves actually, in these times of crisis, have put out plenty of public pleas to the government, to everyone, saying, if you want to support the country, if you want to see a modern, democratic, pluralistic state, we are your best investment. We are teaching Lebanese how to be democratic, how to care about human rights, how to secularize society. Of course, plenty of Muslims look at this. This whole Western enterprise is itself a Christian idea. We recoil at that. Maybe we should. Perhaps it's true. No, these are universal values. It's not how they see it all the time. This is an extension of Christian influence in the world. Now, you step down from the university level. This is where, with my children, of course, still in the grade school level, we are more familiar. Our children go to one of about 23 evangelical schools in the country. Now, some of these actually do preach the gospel. Most of them do not, except for the gospel of human rights, so to speak. But yet, within these institutions across the board, the population of these schools is 65% Muslim. And so this is the entire educational system of Lebanon. 70% of Lebanese schools are private. The public sector educates practically no one, except the very poor who can't afford anything else. And of those 70%, half of them are educated in a Christian setting. So whether it's a Protestant school or an Orthodox school or a Catholic school, so many Muslims are getting the education of human rights in ways that they don't necessarily receive in their Sunni or Shiite respective institutions. Some, of course, also teach these values as well. But a Catholic up in the largely Sunni Muslim city of Tripoli, where they run one of their schools, told me he gets parents coming to him all the time saying, "Father, we don't want their values. Let our children come to your school." And in the middle of this economic crisis, when so few people can afford the education that they're used to, this plea is being heard over and over again by so many Lebanese of all sects. It produces individuals who love their nation. Currently, the head of the Bar Association is a Greek Orthodox Christian. One of his key figures supporting him is a Shiite Muslim. Both of them were educated in the Christian system. One, the Baptist school, that is a sister school to the one that our children attend. And together, they are working on reforming the entire judiciary to the degree that the politicians will let them, But they had a small success recently in extending Miranda rights for the very first time to those who cannot afford a lawyer. Up until now, and the diligent pushing of these two Christian educated individuals, one a Christian by birth, one a Muslim by birth, because of their setting, are now doing what they can to reform the country. The Shiite Muslim told me, I'm basically different than all the other Shiite Muslims I grew up with. I have an open mind and I like to cooperate with everyone. You're not going to get that in every other institution. Is this something that demands support? Are you backing the Christians while you're not backing the Christians? You're backing everyone, but you're backing a missionary institution? These are not easy questions. I'm certainly here in this moment presenting their argument on their behalf. I don't know whether it's right or not. My gut instinct as well tells me no. As Americans, we can't support the Christians. But that's Lebanon. These are the choices that must be made, because you can't simply step out from the outside and imagine they think the way we do. My daughter is evidence that it can't be the case once you live there. Now, at the end here, I do want to just give the final Muslim appeal. When you talk to them about all of these things, they say, yeah, we like your schools, these values are good, but somehow in the end, it's the Christians that wind up having the best government jobs in the end. So even in this capacity, if you wish to perpetuate the system that's going on, hoping that these values of secularism and human rights and open-mindedness apply to everyone, you're going to wind up with that. I have to apologize. I have no solution, but I'm hardly the first one to admit such a thing. But I do want to close with one more verse from Psalms that says, "The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon." And before our eyes, this is what's happening to their country. Lebanon is being broken. Is it God that's doing it? Is it corruption that's doing it? None of this matters for our discussion, but it is happening. And plenty of people might say something that it would take an act of God to change that nation. If there is any degree of hope, however, the verse continues, "The Lord makes Lebanon leap like a calf." So first he breaks it. What comes next? A rejuvenation of new life? All we can do is hope. And certainly to you here in the audience and you listening online, you are invited, as much as you care about the affairs of the entire world, to give your thoughts and attention to see what can we do to untie this knot, solve the riddle that is Lebanon for the good of their people and the good of the world. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to the questions that you will have.
Excellent, Jayson. Thank you very much. We've got some really good questions in the chat. The first question that's come in, we talk a lot about China pushing its economic influence around the world. Is China doing anything in Lebanon?
No. I think there's very little compared to other nations where China is investing. They're not on the horizon at this moment. So Russia has made some plays, but China doesn't seem to really see that it's a vital part of its political and geopolitical interests at this moment.
Okay. How is American evangelical support for Israel seen in Lebanon?
Yeah, it is mostly not appreciated. So Israel is still technically, or at least Lebanon is technically at war with Israel. And so there is almost no love for the nation of Israel. There are some people who will quietly say we should make a peace deal with Israel, just get them off our back, and then we can go on living our lives. But few people would say that. No one would say it publicly. And then if you look to the Christians, even the evangelicals, one of the people who I was able to interview recently wrote a book explaining why evangelical Christians who say that support for the nation of Israel is necessary by faith, they're wrong. And they actually run contrary to the longstanding Reformed tradition that goes back to John Calvin. I haven't read his book, but he makes that case as a scholar to help, one, keep Christians from the American idea, as they see it, that support for Israel is necessary, and also to say to Muslims who are very happy that he's writing this sort of thing, don't blame us because of what you see in America. Now, fortunately, the question is not my opinion on what the right and the wrong is on this issue. However, Lebanese Christians largely dismiss the idea and do not appreciate American support for the nation of Israel.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions into one. The first part is, with the financial troubles and skyrocketing unemployment, we might assume that crime rates are also up significantly. How is that being handled? And then a part two to that question would be, what are the chances?
Yes, thank you for entering our world in the next couple of weeks. We hope to go back to the country in September, and we have to monitor to see what the situation is going to be. Like most nations in the Arab world, crime is very, very low. There is almost no personal petty crime to steal from an individual. Now, there has been an uptick in, I don't know what to call it, but for example, the manhole covers are worth about $100 each. So they are now disappearing from the streets of Lebanon. Kind of making a bad situation worse, the electricity towers that help generate and spread electricity throughout the country, as little as they actually do that, have at their base a piece of metal that is very valuable on the black market. And those are being stolen, and sometimes these towers are falling into disrepair. So people are desperate, and they are finding ways to make money, I guess, as best they can without assaulting their fellow citizens. From what I hear in terms of civil war, there does not appear to be much social expectation that the civil war will return. They say that it was horrible, we will never do this again, and the generation that went through it will beat this idea into the minds of their children. And really, the children are the ones who are most open to the ideas of secularism and liberalization anyway. So I don't have the sense that the country is on the verge of civil war. In any case, it would make no sense. Only one party has weapons, Hezbollah, and nobody else. But if there is going to be war, it's probably very easy to fund them and to get sponsorship for them and have militias just like they did before. In any case, it needs to be feared to some degree. What might be a more realistic scenario, if the government continues to break down and the government fails to function, is that you will get a de facto partition of the country, whereas each sect will then start taking care of themselves. They will be the local police force, they will be the local customs to make certain that goods come in and somehow that my sect gets its share. Now, will they fight the little sect that comes and starts their small little militia on the other side? Probably not. At least it's hoped not. But in this capacity, it seems like you might get a little bit of balkanization where every Lebanese is going to retreat into their own sect because there they know they'll find protection when the government isn't giving them any. I suppose that's a good news answer to some degree, but it doesn't sound like it.
And if you follow along that trajectory, would you be willing to address safety and any other factors for you and your family living in Lebanon on a daily basis?
Yeah, safety is really just in trust of neighbors. I don't know what it's like to live in a country that's breaking down. So if you drive your car down into the city to go to church, what do you have to do if somebody's going to carjack you on the way there? That's not the Lebanese reality. It wasn't the Egyptian reality. So what do? I don't know. But basically, you have to have good relations with your neighbors. You have to know who's in charge of your area. And keep yourself on good terms. I don't know a better answer than that, really. In terms of personal things anywhere, you know, we have no weapons ourselves. There's no personal security. We don't live on compounds. You just fit in with the people, live and love them as best you can, serve and be served, and support one another. I think that's just the best answer for safety anywhere you happen to live.
Thank you. Any likelihood for Saudi and other oil-rich countries to do something to help Lebanon establish a more civil society, or does Saudi Arabia like Lebanon the way that it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me answer it in a differently first. Is it possible that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries might dump in millions of dollars to save Lebanon from utter collapse? Yes, that's possible. They might make an estimation that, okay, if Lebanon collapses completely, it will fall into the hands of Hezbollah and we'll lose everything. So therefore, we'll just keep the engine running to some degree. They might give up on what appears to be a current strategy to disengage. Again, the good or the bad of that is up for grabs. Will they help to reform things? It's only the Western nations that are insisting on reform in a public way. The Saudis and the Gulf are not contradicting this message. I wouldn't want to say that they're actually in favor of corruption, but yeah, there isn't any indication that they are the engine behind this or that they are forcing a reform process out of their Lebanese patrons.
Excellent, thank you. There was a lot of news about the 1.5 million Syrian refugees before COVID. Now we hardly hear anything. Do you have an update of their status?
It's the same as it's always been. They're there. There's no geopolitical consensus to have them go back to Syria. Many Lebanese, especially the Lebanese Christians, want to get rid of them as fast as they can. Lebanon exists on a demographic basis, and most of the Syrian refugees are Sunni. So if they stay, naturalize, it will throw off the balance of power in the country. But in terms of them speaking on their behalf, yeah, they, I mean, some people actually say quite with jealousy, I don't think it's an accurate jealousy, that the Syrian refugees are now better off than many Lebanese, because the United Nations is there helping them, and they're actually transferring dollars into their recipient accounts. This is not a subject that I itself have investigated. So I'm picking up rumors, I'm reading articles that say this is not the case, but I can't really speak authoritatively into the situation. I've been to a few of these Syrian camps. They're still living in tents, you know, so how good can you have it if that's your situation by and large? Lebanon is, however, stressed and flooded with these Syrians who, in the best of times, were a little bit of an annoyance. And now there is that sense in which the xenophobia that comes against the other when you yourself are suffering problems, it's a very real factor in society. It actually blew up in one of the mountain villages, I guess a couple months ago, where they ran every Syrian out of town when there was an accusation of crime against one of them. So that's how deeply this runs. To give a little context on their behalf, the Syrians used to run Lebanon, and they allowed no political freedoms. And those who tried to institute another system, and many of them were Christian in their background, wound up in Syrian concentration camps, disappeared, taken over to Damascus, and never seen again. So the Shiites also have a history where they don't really appreciate the Syrians. So there is so much national animosity towards that country. When the situation reversed and Syrians flooded the border, many of them did not want to help and actually said, good, you're finally getting what you deserve. They took a lot to help get the Syrians to help them. And there's a lot to help, but there's a lot of reticence at the same time.
Is the Islamic State active or a risk in Lebanon?
No. It in 2017, if I have the year right, started to make an incursion into one of the northeast sections of the country. And the reality, I'm not certain, but in some capacity, both the Lebanese Army and Hezbollah participated in driving them away. So there is not a threat to Islamic State expansion in in Lebanon. But throughout those complicated years when they were surging in Syria and Iraq, there were many examples of bombings of mosques and churches when agents affiliated, or at least Lebanese sympathetic to the ISIS ideology, were making trouble in the country. But in any sense of it being overrun or establishing territory, no, that was beaten pretty decisively, and it's not on the reality now.
Thank you. You discussed this briefly. Someone's asking for a bit more clarity. The question is, please discuss Iran's relationship with Hezbollah and the tension that creates in the overall direction of the country. Iran is, quote unquote, ready to help, but many don't want their help.
Yeah. Hezbollah freely admits their sponsorship by Iran, and they speak of resistance not just against the Israeli occupation of the small little territory that is still disputed in Lebanon, but also the greater Middle East. They see themselves as part of the project to resist Israel. So Iran and Hezbollah absolutely are cooperating, and that's not controversial. The Lebanese say so themselves. Recently, Iran said in this current fuel crisis, the electricity crisis that's going on, that we will send barges, boats full of fuel to the port in Beirut, and we will sit outside until your government allows you to let them in. This, if the government allows them to be let in, they would be dealing with crossing United States sanctions against Iran, and it would immediately make Lebanon a pariah state. But in order to kind of show they care, Hezbollah is saying Iran will do this, and we will wait with every Lebanese looking across the waters to see the fuel that is being denied our country, and hope that this swings popular favor in their behalf. Is this a real offer? Is it propaganda? Everyone knows it's not really going to happen, at least until we see what happens with the United States and Iran. Maybe this is one of the things that we're waiting for. Now, who would want Lebanon to move in a more Iranian direction? I have to be careful answering here because in writing for Christianity Today, most of the sources that I interact with regularly are Christians. I don't have my pulse on the Sunni or the Shiite communities to the way that I hope to over time. However, I certainly meet plenty of Shiite Muslims who cannot stand Hezbollah. And they say, okay, we appreciate the strength they give our community. We appreciate that they defend us against Israel, but the ideology that they have in terms of religion, we don't want this for ourselves or our children. So if accepting Iranian help meant becoming a client state of Iran, I would say that there is a sizable part of the Shiite community that does not want that. Certainly Sunni Muslims don't want that. But will things get so desperate that they want help from anyone? Well, you can simply contrast that by the billions and billions of dollars that Western nations have promised to help if only you reform your economy and quit your corruption. So I think the majority of Lebanese citizens would be looking at that saying, we want to be part of the international order. We want to be part of Western conceptions of human rights, coexistence, and open-mindedness. It's simply our leaders that cannot accept that because they would lose their places if the patronage system breaks down. How much of society adopts that idea? How much would really appreciate keeping their sect leaders in power? We don't know. But the revolution that poured out in October 2019 was very popular. And I think so many people assign most blame for Lebanon's problems to their own politicians. Now, maybe they want to keep their politician, but together, every Lebanese politician says of everybody else, you're corrupt, they're corrupt, we're corrupt, just I'm a little less corrupt. So what do you do in a situation like that? How do you claw yourself out of this? God only knows.
Okay. What is the role of the Christian social justice agenda in Lebanon? How can the global North interface with the Lebanese Christian activists promoting Catholic social teaching, the Protestant social gospel, and Orthodox social teaching?
People say of the revolutionary movements that are happening in Lebanon right now, the civil society movements, that there tends to be a bit of a left-wing orientation to them. I can't confirm that that's true, but it squares with the language that they use for social justice and reform. So I would say that this is not unique to Christians. Have I seen ways in which Christian religious figures have adopted such language or that ideology? Yeah, I think so, but I don't want to be too precise in being specific here. I haven't traced the lines that deeply, but certainly I would want to push back to say that these ideas of social justice are a Christian one. It would be true of all of the young and civil society people who are trying to push for a non-sectarian system, that there is a bit of a left-wing orientation, one that does make a lot of Lebanese nervous. Even people who are sympathetic towards a non-sectarian system, there is a deep understanding in Lebanon that we are a capitalist society and that we need to keep a free economy. That is deeply ingrained in them as a people. They've made a lot of money and been successful over time with it. So I've said a lot of words to probably not answer the question well, but both parts of society are really relevant, and it is probably right around that center pole with center right or center left that any of these people would maneuver, even as they unite around the idea of getting rid of their sectarian leadership. Hope that helps.
All right, our time goes till 1:15, so we've got one more question in the queue in the chat. So if anybody has any more questions from Zoom, please submit them now. One more question we have. It is interesting to comment that in 2018, the Lebanese re-elected all their corrupt leaders and the civil society movement failed. This creates the real question of how much the civil society movement is real versus perceived. Do you think that if there was an election today, that the civil society movements would prevail?
It's not fair to simply ask if there's an election. It all depends on how the election law is engineered. These are matters that happened before I arrived in Lebanon, so I'm still playing catch up on them. But each district in Lebanon under the old law had a separate arrangement for who was able to get elected. So in the south, for example, which is very much Shiite dominated with Hezbollah and the other party as well, I believe the threshold for your list to receive any representation at all was maybe as high as like 20%, even 40%. Can't be 40%, 20%. Whereas in many of the coalition type parliamentary democracies in Europe, you get a threshold of 3%. So how is anyone able to get that high level of support where there are entrenched political parties? The deck has been stacked against them. Now, if we imagine that there's going to be a free election, one person, one vote, no, no sectarian lists, no regional sectarian dominance, then maybe is a good answer to that. I mean, we do see, like I'd mentioned, that they are now winning in the free votes of universities and in the syndicates. But I'd say that when I survey what I read of most analysts, there is a sense of pessimism. That is, sectarianism is so ingrained in the Lebanese psyche that people will be unable to waste their vote on an ideal that there could be hope that there's a new system coming, when it's much safer to vote for the leader who protects my sect and makes certain that my family is going to get the jobs we need. Why would I break that in hope that everybody else is going to come alongside the utopian idea to try something different. I am not skilled enough in Lebanon after 2 years to counter the prevailing analyst wisdom, but this is the last question, so we might as well end on some sort of hope. Lebanon is very good at surprising people. So if it is being broken now, might there be an impetus to create something new? Well, the French president said so as much when he promised his aid after the blast, that there needs to be a new Lebanese system. Will that come alone from the Lebanese people? Will it come in conjunction with a regional settlement of all the issues that are going on? Maybe. Really, it's part of a question that would be tied to the whole region. Where is our world going? I'm glad nobody asked me that one.
And actually, I'm going to ask you one final question, and then we'll wrap up. As you zoom out over your entire career and all that you've experienced and witnessed, speaking to us here in America, how would you counsel us to engage in open dialogue? It seems as though we are so polarized that we do a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. How can we be equipped as citizens to dialogue well and to listen well?
One of the aspects as I watch America from afar has been the increasing importance of identity. And in many ways, that is good and proper to correct imbalances that have happened in our society over time. But inasmuch as identity becomes the marker of a citizen, it pulls away from a national ideal and it puts people into camps. And we see very clearly what that does to the Middle East altogether and to Lebanon as a whole. It's dangerous. Now, America has far greater institutional protections than most countries of the Middle East. But we are moving in a direction that is polarizing between groups of citizens based on who I understand myself to be, less on what I think is better for our nation as a whole, my community, my state, our policies. And I think we would do well to take a warning from the Middle East to check ourselves on this regard. Where there is identity, and identities are precious to us, certainly Christians are at the forefront as seeing ourselves as a people of God, distinct from others. We have to be wary of what this does to us in our politics. But the common good is something that has to unite us in a greater capacity. And if not, we simply view the others as an irredeemable enemy that we cannot convince, and we won't even listen to them in the first place to let them convince us. Too many people in Lebanon, for example, have never even ventured out of their main sectarian area. They would never go into a place where Hezbollah operates to buy the cheaper chicken that's sold over there. Why not? It's because it's an identity that's not understood as ours. I would be fearful to do such a thing. Would there be any fear? None. But in the mind, that's not us, and we can't do it. And these groups often don't talk to each other. And if that were to happen in America, it would be to great detriment for our democracy and civil society also.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jayson, that concludes your portion of the presentation, and we're going to pitch back to Saul, President of the World Affairs Council. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jayson. I think your closing comments and that very last question so thoughtfully put as you take a look at the United States and share your perspective on us and the ideological conflicts that we are experiencing and polarization. Not new to us in America, but it's certainly heightened recently. And I think your observations were just so apt. May I just say also, sir, I've watched our numbers of interest as you've spoken. You've lost almost no one in the audience. So we deeply appreciate all of that. And if you're not hearing us, I hope that message can be conveyed to you. Very, very well done, Mr. Casper, and good luck to you and your family as you finish your, I guess, some vacation time here in the United States and on your return to Lebanon. As for our general audience, we have one program in August, not two, and then we'll be resuming 2 a month starting in September. And incidentally, pointing to October, probably October 20 for our first Back Live luncheon presentation, but we'll have more to say about that. Coming up then here in August 18, an old friend of ours returns, Ron Granieri. He has spoken to us several times, presented to us, and we've visited with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, where he is a Templeton Fellow. And he's also the executive director of the Institute's Center for the Study of America and the West. And he is a specialist in contemporary German and international history, and he's going to be presenting to us on perspectives on the upcoming German election, which I believe is in September. I think we're all aware that Angela Merkel will not be a candidate in that election for the first time in well over a dozen years, something to that effect. So we hope you can join us. Ron's always very informative, and will be well served by his presentation. May I just also then remind everyone that we are in the middle of our membership campaign, renewing our membership. Our membership year, program year, is July 1 through June 30. And at least 600 people have received our mailing about that, and we are getting people to join substantially. Our goal is about 250 members, and we just about achieved that this past year. So one way or the other, if you have the material we sent you and you would like to join us, please do. If you're a past member, if you're just interested, join us then. And if for whatever reason you don't have any of that material, go to our website. Consider joining us. Go to the website and click on Join Us and scroll down to the blue box to provide you with contact information, your contact information, and we will then promptly provide you a card to be filled out and returned to us. Membership is our lifeblood, and it helps us with the expenses that we do have associated with some of our programs. So folks, thank you very much for being with us. Have a good rest of your day, and we look forward to being with you again on August 18 with Ron Granieri and his presentation about the German elections.